I think it's time for a channel update. Somebody was telling me that the Bayeux tapestry behind me kind of looked like hieroglyphics, so I couldn't unsee it. I think the yellows kind of washed everything out anyway, so red and black kind of works a little bit better. So if you've followed my channel for some time, you've probably noticed a difference in the progression of how my channel has changed over time. And I figured I would update it for the people that gave a fuck. People obviously watch my channel for the information, not for me, but for those of you that do care, here's an update. The move to Texas changed a lot. Son's grown up a little bit more. This February will actually be 8 years with my wife. And one of the biggest things was the difference in not necessarily the culture, but how things are done in Texas a little bit, specifically around labor laws. Obviously, I moved here in the beginning of 2020. I think it was actually around February. It was like right before the lockdown happened. And then we had George Floyd and all that. And my eyes were opened to a lot. Where I was a staunch, hardline party member, libertarian, coming here, I have been moved further left, simply because I no longer had a lot of the protections in California that I took for granted. If you're unaware, there's an extra labor code in California. They have Cal OSHA on top of regular OSHA, and people really take regulations seriously there. There were definitely times in California where I'd run into a situation where like I had like a boss or something like that, and I'd email them like, hey, there's this thing's going on. I see this liability happen in the future. One company, I told them, hey, we have a blind spot in the cameras. Obviously, I'm in security. Lo and behold, a bike was stolen from that. And then, of course, security was blamed, even though they didn't listen to the people with security experience because they were executives, And stuff like that also kind of started to push me further left before. So while I still consider myself as somebody on the bottom of the political chart, I've never been authoritarian. I have a problem with authority coming from the Marine Corps and being in a hierarchical system where you don't have a choice in doing things. In Iraq, they made us do this like mock Lance Corporal's course. Lance Corporal's course is not a thing. There's a Corporal's course and Sergeant's course, but there is no Lance Corporal's course, but they decided to do one. Part of mine, I was talking about how I think there are too many ranks. Something I noticed in the military was that the people on the bottom who are actually doing all the work are on the ground floor and know what's going on. The disparity between them and the people at the top is so huge. One of the biggest examples is like, when, a higher up officer or a general's coming, right? So everybody cleans up and, does everything the right way. When that's not how the day-to-day works, I gotta wonder, does that general actually know that we're just like buttoning up before he comes in? To a certain degree, they have to know, but regardless, that kind of stuff helped to reiterate how much hierarchy and having power over others is just really a flawed system. And you'll see that in some of my earlier works too. I've pretty much always been anti-hierarchical, which is actually the real definition of what anarchy is. Anarchy, anti-archon. Archon meaning leader. It has nothing to do with chaos or necessarily being anti-having a government. It's just more of a lateral system as opposed to a top-down hierarchy, which is something else people get wrong, but that's a soapbox for another day, and I've ranted a little bit about that on a couple of platforms. So I was already very anti-hierarchy, anti-authoritarian, and then I moved to Texas, and I thought, before I moved, in my head, I had the thought, I'm going to move to a more conservative state, and I'm going to become more conservative. I assumed that I was going to. I assumed that I'd get here, and I'd be like, see, it just works better. The opposite happened. What ended up happening was I finally noticed a lot of the problems inherent in conservatism and free market capitalism. A good way to explain it is there are two ways to approach freedom, and they're not mutually exclusive. You have negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom is basically the libertarian platform. It's less government, less regulation, making things more laissez-faire, letting the money system itself run wild and the chips fall where they may. Adam Smith kind of free market capitalism. Positive freedom, which is something that I've come to embrace a lot more now that I'm in a place that has less labor laws and less protections for those of us without capital. Positive freedom, it's putting things in place that free up the people. So this would be like something like a national healthcare system or some kind of healthcare system that we didn't have to pay for out of pocket, that didn't run on money and corruption and greed. And as somebody that has done security in a hospital, I can attest that is absolutely how the medical system works. All those people that are like, if you go to a socialist country, you gotta wait like 10 hours for a toothache, or I don't know, whatever they say. You gotta wait months for a procedure, blah, blah, blah. Well, one, the reason Americans don't have to wait months for a procedure is because there's a bunch of people that need that procedure that can't afford it. And then two, you do still see that wait. You see that wait in the emergency room because a ton of people go to the emergency room in order to deal with things that they should be seeing a primary care doctor for, but they don't have the money or the insurance, or they lack insurance, or like it was for us in Humboldt. That's where I did hospital security. There's just not enough like specialists or people around. It was kind of a smaller town area, and there's just not a whole lot up there. And the doctors that actually make a lot of money, they ended up moving. You know, they want to go to a place where they can get their money's worth for the degree that they got. And a lot of doctors, this is kind of weird too, are actually contractors. They don't even directly work for the hospital. It's like this weird system. There's a lot of traveling nurses that work the same too. So that was another thing that started my push toward the left, seeing a lot of that. So that's a long way of saying something like a national healthcare system is a positive freedom as opposed to a negative freedom. You're not taking something away in order to create more freedom. You're adding something to create more freedom. Something like unemployment can also be seen as kind of a positive freedom. Too many things in the United States work on some kind of financial metric. That ends up making it to where there's a barrier of financial status. If you don't have enough money, you don't get this thing. If you don't have enough money, you can't get this education. If you don't have enough money, you can't get this healthcare. If you don't have enough money, you can't get your teeth fixed. If you don't have enough money, you're living in the ghetto, right? If a program doesn't have enough money, children are left by the wayside. We see that with Child Protective Services, which in Texas, they are trying to privatize, which is really weird. I guess they're going to keep investigations on the public side, but the rest of it is going private. And I'm like, that's not going to work out. That hasn't worked out for the prison system. Roundabout way of saying, I see that a lot more now than I did in California because we don't have a lot of the protections that California has. California isn't perfect by any means. It's still a neoliberal conservative state, which is something else that I've come to understand through my leftist research. And if you know me at all, you know I'm a very critical person. I like to get multiple sources on things. Basically what happened is I moved to Texas, got disheartened because I finally noticed that conservatism and laissez-faire capitalism did not work. It was not the solution that I thought it was. And I went into kind of a long depressive state. Essentially, I got my worldview pulled out from under me. So I sought a new worldview. I sought solutions. I'm not one to sit around and mope. I am one to seek solutions. I am a fairly driven person, despite life constantly kind of beating me down in the areas where I have been driven. I'm not one to lay down and take it. I am the kind of person who will go out and seek the new knowledge and then approach that thing. One of my favorite Star Wars characters, and definitely my favorite Sith Lord, is Darth Bane, because that's what he did. He was never the strongest Force user. He was never a prodigy like you see with like Luke or Anakin. He kept losing. He kept having setbacks, and rather than find some kind of MacGuffin or some kind of like ill-begotten gain of some sort, some kind of advantage, he would do research. He would go back into the Sith Academy library at one point in the book, do research and reassess, and then come back and hit it harder. And that's how I like to approach life. So that's what I did with politics, with leftism, with my worldview. And I started doing essentially a really deep deconstruction. It's one thing to do like the religious deconstruction and to look at the way that religion itself influences our worldview and to try not to adopt that into your heathenry, right? It's another thing to go back further, look at the whole field, and then really assess where those influences actually lie. That's when I started coming across terms like hegemony and really diving into how much our society has really been influenced by, white Christian colonization. Tons and tons of creators are out there that are willing to share this information. I mean, obviously you can look into like Marxist literature and all that. There are tons of creators out there that are making content that is specifically dissecting the larger hegemony that we are under. And that's basically what I did, is I sought those creators and I rebuilt my worldview in a way where I'm like, okay, now I can see solutions to the problems that I've seen. This has also improved my heathenry because now I'm able to be like, okay, I can see why, like with my archetypalism, I can see why people dislike that and why that rubbed them the wrong way. Perennialism, right? I'm going to do a video eventually on perennialism, going over it more in depth. Perennialism is this colonizer philosophy that essentially says that all religions are one religion. And you can easily see how archetypalism would get there. And now I understand that better. And since I have made peace with a lot of those people that I had conflict with before, simply because I understand where they were coming from a lot better. And also we kind of hashed it out. But now I understand why they were taken aback. And I can explain better to other people that are in similar situations. That's the reason that the channel's changed. And I noticed that conservatism is not what I thought it was. I didn't consider myself conservative. I consider myself a classical liberal. But liberalism is actually a conservative philosophy. The founding fathers of this country were conservatives. They were liberal for their day, but they were this new liberal, right? This is where this neoliberalism kind of started. And it's not to say that they didn't do a lot for freedom, but they also didn't fully understand freedom. My favorite founding father is Thomas Paine, because I think he had a better grasp on freedom. He went to the Iroquois Confederacy. Their system of governance is literally what inspired Thomas Paine's pamphlet, The Common Sense, that inspired the revolution and this new way of thinking. Prior to the founding fathers, democracy was seen the same way anarchy is seen today, which also gives you some context about anarchy. So that's not to say that all of their philosophies and ideas were bad. It's just that it wasn't fully encompassing of what freedom should be. And a lot of that had to do with things that they should have deconstructed, but were not in a mental position to do so. I think Thomas Paine was, light years ahead of his time. He even had ideas around positive freedoms. Like he kind of had a welfare system that would help people get on their feet when they got out of school, right? I can't remember the exact details. I know public schooling wasn't a thing like it is today. Speaking straight from the hip, he had a lot of ideas that this country today really should look at and adopt. But instead, what ended up happening is he got ostracized because they thought he was an atheist. He went to France for their revolution because he wanted to promote freedom there, and he ended up getting arrested, and Benjamin Franklin got him out, and at some point he comes back to the US and dies fairly unknown. At his funeral, he had 2 free slaves and 2 free Irishmen, both of which have obviously had their own conflict with oppressors, obviously with chattel slavery. That one's pretty apparent. And then in Ireland with the English oppressing the Gaelic peoples in general, so Scotland and Ireland. Because he stood up for their freedom too. He was an abolitionist before it was cool. Not on John Brown's level or anything, but you get the idea. And I've had to deal with a lot of shitty companies out here. The very first security company I worked for made me pretty much get rid of my beard. It was pretty much all gone, and then there was about this much near my chin, and I felt like shit. I didn't realize how attached to my beard I really was. That's what made me come up with the beard waiver letter, was having to deal with that and literally getting fired because I did not want to shave my beard for religious reasons, which no employer should be dictating how you look, right? What gives them the right to be like, oh, you need to look this certain way? That is something else that comes back to that hegemony. That is the elitists, the rich people, wanting you not to look like a person, not to look like an individual, but to look like an appliance. Back in the day with landed gentry and all that, the help. Any of the residents of the house were in a room, they literally had to stand there and face the wall and not make any noises and not move, because you weren't a person, you were an appliance. And that mentality, that mood, carries over. In fact, in the South, a lot of that Southern hospitality is actually European aristocracy. That hierarchical, yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, all that stuff that you think of as being polite in the South is in fact part of a hierarchical culture imposed upon the people by European aristocrats, which is something else that I came to realize through study and deconstruction. I had another employer who we had an accident on the job. She was an older gal. They're doing a pool security thing, which already was weird. I've never seen that ever, but this was an events company and I was their security manager. But we had a person that fell, injured her knee, and then rather than the owner even trying to help in any way, shape, or form, she did 2 things. She made me write up I'm not going to file a workman's comp thing that this person signed that I mysteriously didn't file. And the second thing is she prayed over this person. Didn't actually do anything for her, but just prayed over her right in the office. It was weird. Like, I would never see that in California. I'm just sitting there at my desk like, the fuck is happening right now? Just in shock and disbelief. During the interview, I noticed that there was like a God quote on the wall, something about doing everything for God or God first or something like that. You know, one of those pretty typical kind of Christian things. And this lady, you know, obviously she was like super religious, the owner of this company, but terrible person, absolutely terrible person. Lied to me about the raise that I was supposed to get after like, I think it was like a month or two. And she was able to lie because she phrased it correctly in the contract in like such a vague way that she was able to get away with not giving me the raise that she promised me upon hiring. And I remember in a meeting, I will not forget this. We were all in this conference call, and she's like, what am I always talking about? What's the most important thing to me? And the first thing I could think of was money. Because this chick was always like, my margins. Because she wanted that, like, you know, a little bit of extra money. She was just trying to squeeze a little bit of extra money out of literally everything. Oh my gosh, she was such a sleazy salesperson. Which is one of the reasons it didn't work out with that company, because I am terrible at sales. I'm way too honest to be a good salesman. In this meeting, she's like, what's the most important thing to me? And all I could think of was money, because that's what she mentioned constantly. And she said community. I have never heard that woman ever say anything about community. I've heard her talk about her religion. At one point, because she's a female bodybuilder, she like left to some other state and came back with fake breasts, which there's nothing wrong with that. You know, it's your body, you know, do whatever the hell you want to it. Get horns if you want. Nobody should judge you for it, and you should still be able to be hired. But the fact that she was so staunchly Christian and did that, I mean, that's a sign of vanity. And you only did that because you had the money to do it. So you're out here paying people literally minimum wage to do tons of stuff. And you're calling them contractors because it's an events company. These are like temporary contracts, things that come up a lot, which there's a huge problem with that industry because there's a lot more exploitation than most of capitalism. So already it's like a super shady thing. And then she's out here spending who knows how much money on a cosmetic procedure when you've got employees that are starving and struggling. It's just absolutely ridiculous that somebody could justify a purchase like that over actual people's lives. She gave us insurance once, and it wasn't even actual insurance. It wasn't health insurance or anything. It was one of those weird life insurance plans. And of course, it was like literally the cheapest option. She just wanted to be able to check it off a box, basically, to be able to say she did. Because, you know, to a certain degree, because of Obamacare, it's like a legal requirement if you have so many employees, which she probably didn't even have the employee number anyway, because technically all the people working for her were contractors, except for those of us in the office.
I forgot to mention she tried talking me into a Ponzi scheme. It was some weird money pool thing, where everyone would get the money in a rotation, but have to add some to the pot before passing it to the next person. I don't remember what she called it, but shady as fuck.
Terrible companies out here. I had another company, I don't share company names, it's bad practice to do so, but I had one company that was named after something Native American, I won't say what it is, which was already kind of like sus to begin with, but it seemed like a good opportunity. They wanted a supervisor, and it paid a decent amount at the time, which now I make way more as not a supervisor. But this company didn't set anything up. I literally, the first like 3 days of this contract already starting, I was running around trying to set things up. I'm doing hiring, calling people. I'm trying to get more people to come in, doing all that logistical stuff you do as a manager, not even a supervisor. And my title was supervisor. So I'm doing all that. They had a bunch of payroll issues. I'm sitting there, not during business hours, but I'm on the clock because I'm still working, right? Legally, when somebody's working, you have to pay them, despite what they might tell you. And all of a sudden, I'm clocked out and my hours are deleted. And the boss's wife, who happened to work in the office, messaged me and she's like, why are you clocked in? I'm like, well, I'm fixing payroll right now. I was literally putting an Excel sheet together of people's hours to send to the boss. Hours were deleted. Again. I then spoke to the owner of the company and I was like, hey, this is what's going on. And he was like, oh, I'm going to come up there. He was like 3 hours away. He's like, oh, I'm going to come up there and, I'm going to fix things. I'll talk to you guys, blah, blah, blah. Mind you, the reason that I had to do all this was because the stuff I had sent him before to his email, he didn't receive the email simply because his email was also his personal email. It was not a work email, which I'm pretty sure is illegal. It's definitely bad business practice. I haven't seen the law, so I don't want to say for sure, but like, that's just not something you do. You don't use your personal email for business. It's bad. He had so many spam emails because it's literally like the email he got when he got his iPhone. So he's got all these spam emails going to this thing, and he doesn't see the payroll thing I sent him. And he chirped to his wife blaming me. And it's like, why? And I'm over here fixing your payroll for you. And I was like, geez. She even said when she messaged me, she was like, the payroll that you messed up. Like, I did not mess up payroll. That was your husband. That was him not seeing the information that I sent him, so he didn't give it to payroll. And here I am trying to fix their mistake when I got there that evening in order to meet with him because I was doing a night shift. You know, I'm in uniform and everything. As I'm sitting there in my vehicle in their parking garage of the client, I'm looking at the little app we use to clock in. Hours are deleted again. I just grabbed all my uniforms, grabbed everything they gave me. I went downstairs. I set him down in front of that camera, and I told him, no, I quit. I'm not going to deal with this. I'm going to file a wage theft claim. And I ended up having to. After months of giving them tons of information about the hours that I worked with specific timestamps, emails, texts, all that stuff, I even put together all of that in an Excel sheet and sent that to them. Their HR lady, who, lo and behold, was his mother-in-law, and who had no HR training whatsoever, and it was very apparent. She sent me back an email being like, I'm not going to look at all this. That's your job, lady. What are you doing? So I ended up filing the claim and giving all that information to Texas Workforce Commission. So if anybody needs any advice on filing a wage theft claim, I've done it. It was only like $200 or something like that. So all that headache, they argued with me for months, literally accidentally sent me stuff they didn't want to about them deleting not only mine, but other people's hours. I sent all that to the TWC, and it was only like $200 something. All that headache, and you could have just paid me. Just ridiculous. And then not have the government up your ass, you know? I don't know how in depth they go, but I assume if they get enough wage theft claims, they're probably going to investigate you pretty thoroughly. The guy that owned that company was a cop. He's supposed to know the law, you know? Cops don't know the law. They know the laws they arrest you for. It's so bad. So that was something else that was super disheartening, and a small victory because, you know, obviously I won the case, because those business owners, and this is especially true in places like Texas, they don't expect regulators to come out and look at them. They don't expect you to have the gumption or the financial means to fight back. We see that with landlords all the time. I saw that in California. I have these slumlords who would just be absolutely ridiculous. My first apartment, I remember I had a broken window and they literally wrote it off as being fixed after stealing my PlayStation. I was gone for like a week. I come back, window's still broken, PlayStation's gone. They stole it and then marked it off as fixed. And it's like, because of that exploitation, you'll read about that in Marxist literature, and you start putting these things together. The thing that's going to open people's eyes to the oppression of the hegemony of that dominant power isn't reading books. It's not us arguing on the internet with conservatives. It's the life situations that they're in. Because at the same time, while I was going through all this, I am around a population that's more POC than when I was back in California. So I'm seeing people firsthand dealing with oppression. I start to notice in Walmart more how I, as a white man, even though, you know, I have this high-speed haircut and I wear more leather than any straight man should, I get hand-waved whenever I leave Walmart. Every single time I see a person of color, they get stopped. And now I notice that, whereas before I didn't really. I thought that maybe the reason they were waving me was because I was like in security uniform. Maybe they noticed that or something like that. But the people at the local Walmart here, they've never seen me in my uniform. They don't know me. There's too many people here. It's a much larger area. And we start to see those things only after life hits us with a couple of things. It's because I, as a working class person, looked into my own oppression that I finally started going, yeah, other people are also facing that. And then that opens you up to intersectionality. Intersectionality is both oppression and privilege. Working class is something that is historically oppressed. Because I'm white, I can walk around and people don't assume certain things about me. And there's different levels of all this. It's not a black and white, no pun intended, way of looking at oppressed people, privileged people, right? There are different levels of this. And what ends up happening is a lot of us that are, especially male, white working class, tend to be a little extra critical about lives that we've never lived. Like, I've never been a black person. I've never been Hispanic. I can barely tan. My hair is straight. I have a masculine voice. I haven't had to deal with people misgendering me. There are privileges that I have that go unnoticed because I see those as default, because that's what society tells me. Having a character, for example, that's anything other than white male and falls along the Christian lines. A lot of characters in pop culture tend to be vaguely not religious, but anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But we see that as default because that's what society has told us is default, despite those of us lacking melanin actually being a smaller part of the population. And we start to see those things only once we kind of get hit with a little bit of our own oppression. And then we start looking outward and we go, you know what? I'm not a black person. I don't know what it's like to be stopped by a cop and be black. I know what it's like to be stopped by a cop and hassled for being a dude. Even if you have military uniforms in the back of your vehicle, which has literally happened to me. So I'm not going to invalidate the opinions and experiences of other people. I'm going to listen to them. I'm going to take those things in. And then I am going to realize that things are situational. And if we just go around invalidating the opinions and beliefs and experiences of other people, we end up falling into this, like you might have seen with my video on how to spot a crypto fascist, where I highlight the hypocrisy of so-called historical heathen. Also, it's very suspicious initials, by the way. How he just does not see past his own thumb, basically. And that is kind of that hegemonic conservative colonialist mindset where we want to invalidate others, where we want to oppress and all that, where we want to continue threads of oppression that we don't even know exist because we take them as default. There's a lot of things in society that we just assume are default when they're not. Systems in place that are only like a couple of generations old, but because you grew up with them and because your parents were used to them, now you think that's normal. And we have to dissect those things. That's kind of the core of deconstruction, looking at something and actually picking it apart and then applying it to life. It's one thing to say it, especially like I do on camera, right? It's another thing to apply that to your life, which can be difficult. I had another boss, we were talking about, he wanted me to trim my beard. He didn't want me to shave it down like the other company did. And this guy was highway patrol, by the way. My supervisor was talking about religious exemption, like, oh, you know, if they're a Muslim, da, da, da. And this guy, and he was a Hispanic state trooper, he straight up went, if they're a Muslim, they wouldn't work for me. Like, you would never hear that in California. That was a moment for me, but I can't say anything. You know, my beliefs are like, dude, that's fucked up. I can't say anything to that guy because he's in a position of power and he could have taken my livelihood away at the time. So there are certain situations where you're not able to apply that. You're not able to apply your beliefs. You kind of have to bite your tongue because certain situations you're in might put you in a worse way. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with guarding your safety. But when you can, you should put your money where your mouth is. You know, you should stand up for marginalized peoples. You should call out oppression when you see it, but also offer the olive branch when you see it. There are some people that I've interacted with who I'm like, okay, this guy's not a full-blown Nazi. Obviously, he's not like folkish. Maybe he's just libertarian. I can usually get along with libertarian types a little bit better. So he's anti-authoritarian, which is good, but he might tend to have a little bit more conservative ideas, right? Somebody like that, I'm more willing to talk to and to, like I said, extend the olive branch a little bit more than the hammer. You know, you can hammer all day and bash these people, but sometimes that'll make it worse. I'm going to do a video specifically about this. So many planned, right? When we only use the hammer and never the olive branch, sometimes it'll push those people further into conservatism, further into extremity. Saw that with Dot Darling. I don't know how conservative she was at the time. Rather than these so-called leftist men actually standing by what they believed, they went after her and literally sexually harassed her, splicing her image into like pornography and sending it to her and stuff like that. Of course she's going to double down on conservatism and literally platform people like Survive the Jive. Those people aren't splicing her into porn. Those people aren't harassing her like you are. I really like the way my wife put it, and this is a war of compassion. The thing that is going to change people's minds is not you constantly bashing and nitpicking every single little thing. And I hope that I haven't seemed like I'm doing that. I know lately I've kind of made a lot more critiques of people's arguments and a couple more call outs, which is not usual for me. And I kind of want to step away from it. It's just that I keep seeing things where I'm like, okay, I need to talk about this. This is way too popular. People are getting this. Maybe this is something that I got to show people, which also ends up stalling the larger works that I'm doing, like the editing this giant rune video that I'm doing right now. Because if you just go around bashing people, you're just going to push them further in. You're going to dig their heels in. They're going to isolate themselves with other extremists, and they are going to just double down on their ignorance because it's going to be fortified in those spaces. They're just going to have other conservatives around them parroting the same bullshit. So whenever you tell them something, like maybe thinking about what people doing in their bedrooms and judging them on it is bad, actually, they double down on the degeneracy. You can't always bash, you can't always use the hammer. Sometimes you have to either more subtly show something or kind of take a second. And those of us who do fall along those more privileged lines do have more opportunity to do that. One, statistically, people are more likely to listen to white folks, which is jacked up in its own right. If we can de-radicalize and make at least one more person anti-racist and kind of open them up to inclusivity, then it's helpful, right? It's helpful to the overall cause of trying to weed the nazzles out of heathenry. Because heathenry has a long history of racism and racist influence. One big name that comes to mind is Edward Thorson, aka Stephen Flowers. He very much is somebody that peddles a lot of bullshit and isn't somebody that you shouldn't listen to just because of the racial things, but also because he's got other terrible ideas and ahistorical ideas. We have a long history of really terrible people coming into heathenry, peddling their ideas as though they're fact, and not citing their UPG, not explaining where they came from, and people just taking their ideas at face value. And it doesn't help. It only hurts. It only makes things worse. So to a certain degree, we do have to do the call out, right? We do have to point out what to look out for. But in so doing, you also need to accept that people grow, people change. I have been far more conservative in my past. I remember in my early days of heathenry, even like wavering on like folkism and universalism and tribalism and all that, not really being sure what the correct position was. So one of the things that I aim to do with my content is give people the tools to understand what to look out for and all that other stuff. And the only way we can do that is through that dissection of hegemony and that deconstruction and, frankly, decolonization. Understanding that, as a white person who lives on native land, I am a colonizer, and I need to own up to that. I need to understand that I absolutely benefit from being on native land, and that there is like a long history of oppressing those peoples that my ancestors are guilty of that benefits me to this day. That doesn't mean it's my sin, right? That does mean that we can and are guilty of perpetuating the same exploitation that our ancestors did, that the Europeans that colonized America did. Not that the actual Europeans are not guilty of this either. They were the colonizing powers that also benefited. In fact, the Scandinavian countries still to this day, the reason they're able to have this like socialist utopia is because they're exploiting these undeveloped countries, what we used to consider the third world, because they're exploiting the gas resources, the fuel resources of those countries. They're able to have this nice, clean society with all these electric vehicles. And it's like you're still doing the oppression. I kind of want to do a video about that too, because I've encountered several Europeans who are like, but I'm not guilty of it. I'm not a colonizer. Okay, but you descend from a colonizing power. You'll notice that I'm very big on specificity of language. I'm not saying that you're a colonizer. I'm saying that you are a colonizing power. Right? I had an argument in some comments with some Icelandic people because they didn't understand that. That while, as far as I know, Iceland didn't participate in any of that, that doesn't mean that Denmark, when they founded Iceland, and Norway also had some influence over them, that doesn't mean that those weren't colonizing powers. That doesn't mean that Greenland to this day is still technically a colony of Denmark. There's going to be things in those cultures that we take for granted. The world has an issue with colorism. The idea that even if you are a melanated person, the less melanated, the better. They will literally oppress and look down upon people that are darker. And it's like, It's all climate adaptation. You are literally judging people based on an arbitrary climate adaptation. My ass is unmelanated because my melanated ancestors went to an area that was cold and evolved to have less melanin because there was less sunlight. That's it. That's the reason I am pale. Whereas other people, their ancestors are in a sunnier area, so their skin needed to stay darker to adapt to the sun. All these little differences that we nitpick, all these little differences that racists have nitpicked over the millennia are really just these little arbitrary dumb things. And they don't realize it. And that stems from the aristocracy always looking for that next thing that made them different from the rabble. So anyway, that's a long way of saying that's a lot of the reason why my channel has changed in the ways it did. You'll notice that if something is more political, I keep it in wolf droppings. And nothing exists in a vacuum. Religion is going to be influenced by politics. Politics is going to be influenced by religion. And, both are going to be connected to a million different things. We cannot divorce it fully from those things. Something else people don't really understand. I do try to keep things, if I feel like this is more of a political thing, I'm going to throw it in wolf droppings. Maybe you don't want to hear it, and that's fine. Understand that if it's in wolf droppings, it's more of my opinion, and it may not necessarily have to do with heathenry per se, which is why the crypto-fascist thing was under wolf droppings, which the 3 people unsubscribed probably didn't understand. And the other thing is, human decency is not political. It's not. Treating people with kindness, accepting their pronouns, accepting their identity, not dictating how somebody should look, not telling consenting adults that their relationship is degenerate. They are a deviant. Personally, I think deviant should be a positive term because you are deviating from the norm, from the typical vanilla way that people live, which I've always seen as a good thing. I think people that go with the flow and want to conform are, 1, boring, but 2, there's always something like odd about them. Like they want to conform to being like normal, but it's like, I don't know, I've always been a little off put by those people. I worked for a guy like that who just wore way too much khaki, and he was a weird guy, really weird. He had some weird ideas, but not to get into another rant about a boss I've had. That's another big thing. I'm anti-conformity. I'm anti-conforming to something simply because that is the norm, that is the standard. A lot of those basics are still going to be true about my channel no matter what. I'm anti-authoritarian, always have been. I'm more inclusive now than I used to be because I understand it better. I understand the pitfalls that conservatism can cause. And I'm getting a lot better feedback on TikTok. I only joined TikTok because my wife downloaded it, and I was like, oh, this might be interesting. I'm just going to try it out, whatever. She seemed to like it. And then it ended up being a really good way to build community. I've had a lot of positive feedback there, a lot more subscribers. I'm getting close to 10,000. I'm still not there yet. Here on YouTube, I haven't even hit 2,000. I'm still teetering under 2,000, and it's been like 5 years now. I think 5 years this month, in fact. But the growth there is obviously bigger. And then also when people rebut, there's less anonymity. And I think that's a big important thing. Because like you see that on Reddit too. There's a lot of anonymity on Reddit. And I've had a lot of positive interactions on Reddit, especially with r/Norse paganism. But there's so much more anonymity there. And I think that's one of the big problems with internet discourse in general is the anonymity. So I think that's why TikTok tends to be a bit more of a positive platform, is because of the lack of anonymity. Because those people that have their account set to private or don't really post anything and their username is 6841 or whatever, those people, you tend to just call them out and be like, yeah, private user. Okay, you're obviously a troll. The public trolls are kind of interesting. The one I dealt with, last I heard, she was harassing the deaf community now. She moved on from pagans to the deaf community. Like, my God, woman, just let it go. Some people just get off on that kind of stuff, and it's like you just develop a reputation for being a shithead. I hope this update helps people to understand where I'm coming from with my channel. I hope that you understand that no, this is not becoming a more political channel, but I do understand that religion does not exist in the same vacuum that I believed it had before, being a filthy centrist, and that human decency isn't political. When I make videos talking about like trans rights or people of color just being anti-racist, that stuff isn't political. The only reason that you think it's political is because there are people in power who want you to think it's political, because they use it for political leverage. And that's messed up. Using somebody's identity or the fact that they're historically marginalized as a point of leverage, usually towards hate too. That's bad. Like, obviously, we have to fight to a certain degree to have those rights. I'm not going to stop being somebody that is pro-freedom. I just understand what being pro-freedom is more now than I used to. And in my evolution of who I am today, that has changed for me. That has become more nuanced, and I will constantly be learning, constantly be changing. Obviously, the channel is going to reflect. If I see a problem, obviously I'm going to call it out. If I see an issue, if I see something that I think people need to learn more, or if I see something that I wish I knew more about, that's when I make a video. Obviously, I wrote a book, I think it was last year. It's kind of a thin book. I have more of those coming too down the pipeline. Videos are definitely more my medium, and I'm trying to knock a few more of those out. I'll probably come out with a second edition of Drengskaper, where I also elaborate on some more things. Maybe this next year I'll work on that. So yeah, that's pretty much why my channel has changed the way it has. Still out here trying to teach people about heathenry in the best way I can. I hope that I am one of many resources for you, and I hope to share decent resources with you. I'll probably come out with another intro type video sometime this year, be with different sources. I didn't realize when I put out that video that Dot Darling was as bad as she is, mostly because I think she's doubled down on conservatism, but I still need to do a video about that. I hope you guys stick around. Obviously there's not like almost 2,000 people that actually listen to me flap my gums. I think it's like 50 people that usually look at my video. Thanks. I appreciate that. I hope to keep pushing out content. My family's doing great. The boy's in first grade, which is interesting. He's getting bigger. And that's been a whole learning experience. In a nutshell, that's pretty much it. That's why my content has changed the way it has, and it'll change and grow and develop as I do. If you ever disagree with me, comment. I'm on many a social media under Goldie Grimwolf or Just Grimwolf. If you see my logo on there, that's me, or that's probably me. As far as I know, there aren't any dummy accounts out there of me yet, probably because I'm not selling anything. With that, be better tomorrow than you were yesterday. We are the sum of our actions, not our words. Skull.